Welcome to Kaleidoscope. Let's talk. According to the Global Peace Index, Sri Lanka is number 107 out of 163. Iceland is at number 1 and Afghanistan is at the bottom at number 163. It seems that Sri Lanka, however, is closer to the bottom of the list than it is to the top. But while we speak of peace being an organic process, have we ever wondered the role that geopolitics plays in mooting a sustainable peace? On Let's Talk today, I sit with Nilanthan Niruthan, who is the Executive Director of the Centerforlaw&Security Studies. He's a defense analyst and commentator on global and national security issues, including hybrid warfare, maritime piracy, military technology, and urban insurgency. Some of his articles have been published in the Johns Hopkins Journal of International Affairs and the Columbia Journal of International Affairs. Welcome, Niruthan, to Let's Talk on Kaleidoscope. Firstly, tell me, why is peace so elusive in this world?
So there are two main reasons. The first is that most institutions around the world don't seem to desire peace. They seem to desire giving the illusion of peace rather than actual peace. And the second seems to be a biological reason where humans are naturally competitive, and therefore when we look at things like national borders and territorial resources, there doesn't seem to be any other option at the moment than fighting each other, unfortunately.
So how much of peace is organic in a country and how much is reliant on geopolitics?
So none of it is organic. All of it is reliant on geopolitics. So you could have the most peaceful society, but if the geopolitics change, you could be conquered, you could find yourself in a war, you could find all kinds of interferences in your affairs. So peace itself is not a natural state. Conflict seems to be the natural state. Therefore, your geopolitics will shape everything in that regard.
What about Sri Lanka? Are we able to build a sustainable peace given the geopolitics?
We can, in my judgment, if we are aligned to a specific power base. Our problem is that we've never really been aligned in the long run.
So how much of peace is organic in a country and how much is reliant on geopolitics?
Our closest friend in the region or internationally changes. If we can keep one partner for a generation or two, yes, we can safeguard our geopolitical interests.
Sri Lanka has always called itself non-aligned. But does being non-aligned work?
Not in my assessment. When I look at the history of non-alignment, not only for Sri Lanka, but essentially for any other country, non-alignment just means you stand for nothing. And non-alignment essentially means that you can attend a lot of conferences and you can make a lot of gestures of camaraderie, but nobody really comes to your aid when you need it. Alignment is what gets you friends who will come to your aid when you need it.
So some examples of countries that are aligned and have made it a success?
So if we look at all the rich countries in Asia, for example, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Japan, South Korea, all of them are very specifically aligned over 2-3 generations to one particular power center. And that's been a major reason for their rise to the top. So just look at any of the rich countries in Asia, they will all be aligned.
If you look at Sri Lanka, what are the benefits we will have and how should we align ourselves and who should we align ourselves to?
So that's a difficult question. There are pros and cons aligning ourselves with either China or India or the United States. Culturally, India and the United States would be easier for us to synthesize. At the same time, the Chinese don't really put the same types of demands on us that the Americans or the Indians might. So purely from a Sri Lankan sovereignty point of view, I would say India would be the best partner right now because there's a synergy of interest with both. But once again, the decision would have to be up to the long-term policymakers of this country, not short-term analysts like myself.
How important is leadership when it comes to forging a holistic peace?
Leadership is everything, particularly in our context in two key areas. The first is in creating some kind of consensus on what peace is. Because right now, from what I can see, there is no bipartisan or multipartisan consensus even on what peace and reconciliation would actually mean in this country. The second is in terms of mending or fixing or strengthening our relationships with other nations in the world. We need somebody who can be a statesman rather than a politician. And that's where the role of leadership, both in your domestic and your global security, come in.
Complex as it sounds, does a benevolent dictator work?
I mean, benevolent dictators have worked. For example, I mean, you could say Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore is a benevolent dictator. You could say Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia as a somewhat benevolent dictator. So, in theory, nothing stops that from working. But in practice, what we find is that almost all of the benevolent dictators inevitably turn malevolent at some point once too much power goes to their head. So that's the risk. On paper, yeah, sure, it could work. But in practice, we see them going down a slippery slope too often.
Hybrid warfare and cyber warfare in geopolitics, how do these impact us?
These impact Sri Lanka in a great way because these allow countries to not only wage war against us, but infringe on our interests without making it obvious. So hybrid warfare, for instance, is warfare with political, legal, and military means in order to destabilize a nation. So legally, politically, there are many things that countries around the world can do to us. In terms of cyber warfare, there are just these hobbyist hackers in China, India, the United States, who could wreak a lot of havoc in a small country like ours. So these technological challenges will always be a major minefield that we need to navigate through.
The smaller the nation, the more vulnerable. Is this the case when it comes to Sri Lanka?
It's more to do with your political size rather than your geographic size. So, for example, Israel is geographically smaller than all of its neighbors. But Israel has repeatedly defeated all of its neighbors in many wars. Singapore is smaller than all of its neighbors, but Singapore has far more geopolitical power than Malaysia or so. So it has more to do with your alignment and with things like your per capita income rather than simply the geographic size.
Looking around the world, are there countries that have forged a real peace?
In a sense, yes. I mean, Britain and France fought each other for 200 years and they've had over a century and a half of unbroken peace now. So there are parts of the world where long periods of war are followed by long periods of peace. And we have made a lot of progress. Humanity, the world in general, despite what the news tells us, is a lot more peaceful today than it was, let's say, 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So long-term peace is possible, but specific places will never have peace forever. There will always be some kind of conflict that breaks out somewhere periodically.
So what about things like economic warfare, social warfare, environmental warfare?
Absolutely. I mean, there's cultural warfare, information warfare. There are so many different types of warfare that we can categorize, which is why in the old days, military scholars never really tried to categorize warfare. They took it all. So if you read Kautilya in the Arthashastra written 2,500 years ago, for example, I mean, he talks about economic warfare and diplomatic warfare and things like that. So war comes in many different avatars or faces, and it's our job to be able to decode that.
How can a country like Sri Lanka circumvent the issues that geopolitics brings and work towards a sustainable peace in some format or another?
I do feel that alignment should be our way forward because historically, statistically, especially in Asia, that has been the way to achieve long-term stability and prosperity. As long as peace goes, once again, if we can have some kind of all-party consensus on what we mean by peace, what we mean by reconciliation, if we can just get the parties to agree on some kind of common narrative, that itself would go a long, long way in long-term peace building.
So for a leader of Sri Lanka, what should the playbook be in attaining that?
A leader capable of creating some kind of all-party consensus and a leader capable of aligning the country in the long run with a specific power center in a way where even the successors of that leader carry on with that policy. One of the big failures of our leaders so far is in their inability to implement long-term policies. If they lose power and the opposition party comes in, the policy changes. So you need some kind of vision where you know that regardless of who wins the next election, we have a fixed policy alignment to stick to.
We do live in hope, don't we? Kaleidoscope is on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. Be sure to subscribe and follow us if you want more of Kaleidoscope.